On a cold, dark morning of February 2nd in the year 1907, Nellie Seaman, with disheveled hair and unstrung nerves, carefully trudged through snow and ice in the bitter cold to make her way to Jackson Street, to the home of her landlord, Louis Ebert. Louis Ebert opened the door, and Nellie informed him that her husband, Abraham Seaman, had shot himself in their bed, and hopefully was still alive and needed medical attention. 27-year-old Nellie Hill met 42-year-old Abraham Seaman while both working and living at the Charles L. Meade farm in Middletown, Orange County, New York. Charles Meade was a wealthy farmer, treasurer for Orange County, lawyer, and politician. Abe Seaman was born in Sullivan County, a widower and third-generation farmer. His father and grandfather owned large farms in the area. Abe often bragged that one day he was going to run his own farm. Nellie was said to be well educated, as she had taught school in Sullivan County, New York, where she was born and raised. She was beautiful and vivacious. We don't know how she ended up working at the Meade farm, but apparently she had been jilted by a lover, and in trying to get her man jealous, fell into the arms of Abraham and married him. Now, during the shooting investigation of Abraham Seaman, we find out that Abe had severe bouts of depression and once tried to kill himself with a shotgun. Abe said it was just an accident during a hunting trip. Nellie said it was to end his own life. The neighbors surrounding them said Nellie tried to kill him. Nellie's mother said her daughter did all that care and money could buy to save her husband's life. This case becomes very complicated along the way, and in the end, we leave it up to the viewer to determine whether Abraham Seaman was murdered by his crazy wife, or was Nellie Seaman silenced by her husband and the community. Her ghost has shown up on the Haunted Beacon Ghost Walk. Let us know what you think. By 1901, Nellie and Abe had a 14-year-old daughter named Ruby. And Nellie was pregnant with a son when Charles L. Meade and his brother Roswell sold their farm in Middletown to go on to other endeavors. The Seaman family moved to Denton, Chester, and Goshen, New York, before landing in the bustling factory village of Matteawan in Dutchess County, New York. This 5-square-mile area rested on the banks of the Hudson River beneath the beautiful highland mountain range of Mount Beacon. The numerous factories benefited from the power of the Fishkill Creek that emptied into the Hudson. The riverside was the village of Fishkill Landing, and the mountainside was the village of Matteawan. These villages joined together in 1913 to form the city of Beacon. Matteawan's history began with one of America's first cotton mills and community, built by Peter Henry Skank, descendant of settler Madam Katharina Rombout Brett, and William B. Leonard of Taunton, Massachusetts. Their investors included wealthy and influential high-ranking members of New York City society, such as Mayor Philip Hone, Samuel Howland, and John Jacob Astor, all interconnected as family. Anyone who wanted to live or work in Matteawan were required to take a vow of abstinence from alcohol. People filled the churches more than they did the bars, but by the time of the Civil War, 118 bars lined Main Street from the river to the mountain, and over time, Beacon became known as having a bar on every corner. Abraham Seaman found a job in Fishkill Landing, working at a coal yard owned by the wealthy Mr. Weldon B. Weston, who was also at the time the president of the village of Matteawan. Abraham moved his family into one of the many tenement buildings near the factories on the corner of Fountain Street and Mill Street, now known by Beaconites as East Main and Spring Valley Streets. The tenement was known for many years as the Beacon Beehive Tenement. Now, beehive was a derogatory term for tenements that were filled with criminals, drug and alcohol-addicted peoples, and poverty-stricken children, etc. It was a 3-story house with 6 tiny apartments that housed 18 families. The landlord of this building was Louis Ebert, a wealthy and prominent business owner who traveled for 30 years every day to New York City for work. He lived on nearby Jackson Street in a large Victorian with beautiful gardens. His sons went to Ivy League schools, and one even lived in one of the largest mansions in Beacon called Roseneath. This Beacon Beehive tenement was also known as the Flatiron Building. Although a normal housing structure, it sat on a triangular piece of property. And it was a thorn in the side of the progress of the city of Beacon for many years, and was finally condemned and torn down in 1930. Dr. Atwood was called and arrived at the Seaman's sparsely furnished tenement apartment. Abraham was pronounced dead immediately. Upon first inspection, it was concluded that Abraham had shot himself based on the gunpowder on his shirt. In spite of this, Nellie found herself under suspicion of murder, and they brought her to the Fishkill Landing jail for questioning. Nellie protested vehemently on being arrested. She insisted she was innocent and did not know her husband was dead until she returned home after her visit to the landlord Ebert's house. Nellie told the police that she and Abraham turned in for the night on February 1st. They slept on their couch, which doubled as a bed at night. Waking from a loud gunshot, Nellie found her husband struggling and beating the air with his hands and feet. And as she jumped to get out of bed, her hand touched something cold, and she knew it was the revolver. Not knowing what her husband would do next to her, she grabbed the gun and sat down in the rocking chair, dazed and frightened. Too poor to afford lamp oil, she rocked till daylight began to fill the room, grabbed her shawl, and ran to get help. It's curious that the gunshot did not wake any of the neighbors crammed into such tight quarters. Just a few months before this tragedy, the Seaman's daughter Ruby had married her neighbor Frank Pendleton. The Pendleton family was large and filled the surrounding tenements and private homes. Abraham Seaman hated Frank Pendleton and was upset that Ruby had married him the previous November. A few weeks before the shooting, the Seamans got into a knockdown, drag-out fight with the Pendletons, and they were all arrested. Nellie accused Frank of abusing her daughter Ruby, but she couldn't prove it. Frank, disgusted with his father-in-law, cut off all contact from seeing Ruby or ever visiting their home again. We are never told exactly what Abraham had done to Ruby to cause such an extreme reaction from her husband. Losing Ruby caused Abe to sink further into hopelessness and despair. Neighbors said Abraham told them he would rather die than be without Ruby, and threatened to shoot himself. During the investigation, Nellie's neighbors came out strongly against her. They said that the Seamans were often heard fighting and carrying on. Although they felt that the 47-year-old Nellie was still beautiful for her age, having piercing blue eyes and well-cut features, they described her as being immoral. Abraham had often accused Nellie of having affairs with the younger men in the community, and the neighbors believed this. They witnessed Nellie slapping her husband, pulling him around by his mustache, throwing a rock at his head while she was walking on Mill Street with bartender Ralph Nolan, while Abe was sneaking behind them, and she even showed up once at the coal yard and attacked him in front of his workmates who were afraid she was going to push Abe into the Hudson River. What Abe was doing to trigger this hostility in Nellie is never shared in the papers. The neighbors felt that Nellie controlled Abe, took all his money, and he followed her around like a love-struck puppy dog in spite of the bickering. They also witnessed Nellie telling Abe she wished he was dead. Apparently, she had asked Frank Pendleton and his brother Charles, who many thought was Nellie's lover, to get Abraham a job at the New York Rubber Company on Tioronda Avenue and push him into the grinder to his death. She said this was because Frank and Charles worked there, and their position was grinder. A few weeks before the shooting, Abraham had gotten seriously ill, and the doctor informed him that it was incurable. The neighbors said Abraham had told some of them that if he was ever found dead, they should make sure there was an investigation done. When a reporter asked Nellie if she had ever threatened her husband's life, she replied that she didn't know what she might have said, because everybody gets excited and angry once in a while. She couldn't remember if she had threatened him or not, but she caught herself and told the reporter she thought she shouldn't be telling him any of this. Charles Pendleton told the detective that Nellie had asked bartender Ralph Nolan to help her put the old man out of the way, and she promised to split the $200 insurance money with him. However, Ralph Nolan denied this had ever happened. Charles had been recently arrested for intoxication, and the police apparently kept him in jail to find out what else he knew about Nellie. On top of this, Charles Pendleton admitted to being Nellie's lover. But in the end, they didn't believe Charles' testimonies. The general consensus was that Nellie's fighting with Abraham was a sign that she was insane. A contributing factor to this was, at the time, on the outskirts of town, was the Matteawan Asylum for the criminally insane. Over 600 patients filled the building built for 500, and many were some of America's worst criminals. And it influenced the mindset of the community. Nellie's neighbors claimed Nellie was just like serial killer Lizzie Halliday. Although, other than fighting with her husband, there was no indication that she had conflicts with anyone else in the community or had hurt anyone. Also, at this time, the Harry Thaw fiasco was playing out. Long story short, Harry Thaw shot architect Stanford White in the face at Madison Square Garden after finding out Stanford had drugged and raped his beautiful actress and model wife, Evelyn Nesbit. Thaw was declared insane and brought to the Matteawan prison. The Thaws were a wealthy and influential and powerful family. Needless to say, Harry received special treatment at the asylum. His mother was staying with the local chief of police. She had her son's meals brought into the asylum from the local Holland Hotel because the potatoes they served in prison were making poor Harry fat. He was brought up on hikes up the mountain and shopping trips on Main Street. And one day, conveniently, a gate was left open and Harry simply walked away to freedom. It was also a time in America where women were thrown into the asylums not just for being insane, but actually for insane reasons. A local German woman of Beacon went to the police to report that someone was stalking and threatening her. They didn't believe her and did nothing, so she told them off and basically said the police in Germany would do a better job than them. So they sent her to a doctor who declared her insane and shut her away in the asylum. Another woman in another city was sent to the asylum for visiting a hot dog vendor every day for lunch, and because she was a woman of high status and wealth, she could certainly afford better food, so she was declared insane and sent to the prison. Another young orphan girl was thrown into the asylum for not having a chaperone at a party because she didn't have a family to accompany her. One young woman was accused of a crime she didn't commit, and they put her in the asylum. But by the time they discovered she was innocent, she had become insane from her time in prison. Now, the Seaman tragedy court proceedings dragged on for about 4 months. In the beginning, Nellie was reported as being stoic and quiet, and the papers declared she could care less what happened to her or her husband or what would happen to herself. One of the more bizarre occurrences was when 2 weeks after the shooting, the court held a funeral for Abraham Seaman. Only men attended, including Abe's coal-shoveling buddies, who supplied a silk pillow for Abe's head from the company of Weldon Weston. Then the court gave Nellie a black mourning dress and black veil that covered her face, and she was brought out the back door of the prison and taken to a small room where Abe's body was laid out. One news account felt she had, up to this point, complete control over her emotions, but upon viewing her dead husband's body, she broke down and wept bitterly. And they left her there all night. One newsman's opinion of the treatment of Nellie was that if the woman was daft, she should be cared for at once and not have to suffer through all the excitement and harrowing experience of a trial. But this statement was ignored. Police Chief McCabe, upon searching the Seaman apartment, discovered dream books and gypsy literature. These types of books on mysticism began to take hold in the country around 1890. The police felt her interest in the topic proved her mental instability. However, Nellie's court-appointed lawyer was a local Matteawan man named James G. Meyer. Mr. Meyer was married to the granddaughter of a wealthy factory owner. Mr. Meyer's daughter, Marion Meyer Drew, who was about 18 years old at the time of the tragedy, became a well-known astrologer who gave readings to famous people such as President FDR and wrote a column in a newspaper called Your Stars Today for many years. Her second husband was also a famous astrologer. In spite of this, there is no evidence that Marion Drew had ever been accused of being mentally unstable. As the testimonies of the neighbors increased against her, including her own daughter Ruby and her husband Frank, Nellie began to become irritated. Nellie's reaction to Ruby and Frank's testimony was writing a letter from prison. This letter was published in the newspapers, declaring that Ruby was not actually her child.
I'm not your mother!
She explained an odd and questionable incident. Apparently, when Ruby was an infant, Nellie had placed her on a bench at a train station. Another woman placed her infant on the same bench. When the train arrived, the other woman took Nellie's infant instead of her own. Nellie searched for the woman and searched the newspapers, but eventually just accepted the mistake and raised Nellie as her own. But she ended the letter saying that she was not Ruby's mother and couldn't tell Ruby anything about herself. Was Nellie trying to save Ruby from being attacked as insane from a judgmental gossip of her neighbors, or was this yet another sign of her instability? It came out in one article that Nellie had actually written many letters from jail to other members of the community. These letters, however, were not published in the paper, and it was never reported as to who the letters were addressed to or what Nellie had said to them. At one point, as they were trying to bring Nellie to the courts, she refused to leave her cell until they brought her a new pair of stockings. She had been wearing the same stockings for 4 months. So they declared this uppity woman was certainly insane. But the prison guards said she had been a model prisoner. She often helped with the housework at the prison and even made 2 quilts for the beds in 2 weeks. But she did sometimes sit on a bed or in a chair for many hours, staring and saying nothing. Others reported that at times she was lighthearted and gay. By April, Nellie began to believe that her lawyers were conspiring against her. She slapped one of the prison keepers in the face and tried to kick her lawyer. She demanded having John B. Stanchfield as her attorney. Mr. Stanchfield was currently the lawyer for Harry Thaw. So again, her outrageous demands proved her insanity case. There was only one newspaper that reported that Abraham and Nellie had a son. The neighbors said this 4-year-old boy had died 2 years prior. It was not told how he died, and some indicated that Abe was not the real father of the boy. Nellie refused to let anyone take him from her. For 4 days, she would dress him up in his best clothing and sit with him on her lap in front of a window. When the neighborhood children would see this, they would run home crying to their parents. When she finally agreed to a funeral, she wouldn't let them close the casket until she put his coat on so he wouldn't be cold. According to their daughter, Nellie's anger after this toward Abraham increased. Ruby said one night she became so angry with him that she threw their marriage license into the wood-burning stove and declared she had never married him. It was also around this time in history when many women worked in factories in many cities across the U.S. A factory in New Jersey, as well as one in Matteawan, reported that one day, one by one, all the women visited their manager's office and threatened to quit because they had hired a new girl who had a bad reputation or was considered a rough girl. Younger than her husband, Nellie was quite healthy, but very, very poor. Abraham had only 45 cents in an envelope when he died and hadn't worked in weeks. It's curious as to why Nellie did not have a job. The general consensus was that Nellie had married Abraham for his money, and Abraham was not even the father of the children. Nellie's mother tried to help by sending a letter to the court saying that was a marriage of love. She stated that Abraham, who had already tried to kill himself in Middletown, was known to have queer bouts of depression and anxiety. Losing his daughter to Frank Pendleton had caused him great stress on top of his recent illness and finding out that it was incurable. As the case against Nellie's sanity grew over the next 4 months, she became more and more vocal and upset and declared to the prison keepers at the Dutchess County Jail the following statement. I object to being regarded as insane. I am perfectly sane. I shall not go to an asylum to end my days without a protest. I demand a trial, and it must be either the electric chair or liberty. According to Nellie, 6 months before the shooting, Abraham Seaman's home was broken into and 2 men attacked and beat him up. They called it a robbery, but the Seamans lived in poverty and didn't really have anything to steal. Abe became very fearful after this and purchased a revolver. He constantly carried it around wherever he went and placed it under his pillow at night. By April, local merchant Gabriel Hart stepped up to testify that it was Nellie who purchased the gun with $5 2 weeks before the tragedy. According to Hart, Nellie discovered that the gun had the wrong type of bullets, and she returned to his shop to purchase the correct ones. The court wondered how a woman of Mrs. Seaman's mode of living, eking out a bare existence, ever got a $5 bill. Nellie simply repeated that Abe purchased the gun and shot himself. The coroner's investigation determined that Abraham was right-handed, and with the way he was laying and the direction the bullet went into the chest, it proved that he could not have shot himself. Nellie and her mother both testified that Abraham was ambidextrous and could use both hands. But the men who worked with Abe at the coal yard insisted Abe shoveled with his right hand, so that settled that. During her indictment in April, Nellie quietly stood before the judge, dressed in the black funeral gown the court had given her. The papers described her as being ghastly pale, but she did not appear at all to be nervous. Then finally, in May, Coroner Knapp of Dutchess County gave his final opinion that there was enough evidence to prove that the pistol was purchased and fired by Nellie Seaman and was premeditated, with the design of causing the death of her husband. And they concluded that she was insane and would be sent to the Matteawan asylum. Her fate was sealed, and the prison guards reported that she sank into a dark, morose, and glum demeanor. The day the carriage arrived to transport her to Matteawan, the streets were lined with people waiting to get a glimpse of their insane neighbor. Nellie woke up in a bad mood and refused to get out of bed. After pleading and prodding, she reluctantly let them put on her funeral costume, complete with black veil over her face. She was taken again out the back door of the prison to the carriage. She stopped and looked around to see that crowds of her neighbors had come to gawk at her and witness her demise. So in a last-ditch effort to save herself from her fate, she decided to make a run for it and took off down the street. The guards chased her for about a mile. They tackled her and dragged her back, kicking and screaming, refusing to get in the carriage, bracing herself with all her might. It took 6 men pushing and pulling to finally get her into the carriage as she sank into the front seat, and they took off toward the Matteawan asylum. She managed to get one last kick in and shattered the carriage lantern. I imagine it was not a pleasant ride down to Matteawan. All news of Nellie went dark and quiet until 1914, when her obituary appeared in the news. It claimed that she died from Bright's disease, which is inflammation of the kidneys caused by toxins, infection, or autoimmune conditions, which are often made worse by poor diet and stress. Abraham Seaman was buried in the Fairview Cemetery at Matteawan. Where Nellie was laid to rest is unknown. Mrs. Nellie Seaman has made her presence known on our haunted Beacon Ghost Walk. What does she want? What is she trying to tell us? Purchase your tickets at Beacon Walking Tours and find out.